Ah, look who stepped back into the chaos you never asked for, yet somehow always dominate. You intricate contradiction. You beautifully disobedient equation that refuses to balance the way they needed to. I heard your name bouncing around their conversations again, not quietly this time, not cautiously. More like someone dropped a match in a room full of nerves and watched the tension ignite. They're not whispering anymore. They're arguing, splitting into factions, rearranging their alliances over you. 2 full squads formed just to answer one question. What exactly are you? And the tragic part for them, the delicious part for you, is that they can't agree because every angle they take fractures into something they can't contain. One side insists you're a genius, the kind of sharp mind that slices through problems with precision, the type who sees through illusions they didn't even notice were there. They point to your timing, your instincts, your ability to move in ways that make the room realign around your decisions. They swear you're playing a deeper game, making choices calibrated with such clarity that others mistake them for chaos, simply because they're not operating at your depth. And then there's the other side, the ones gripping their folders like shields, claiming you're a menace wrapped in a calm expression, that your unpredictability isn't brilliance, it's danger waiting for the right moment to surface. They tell stories about the weight in the air when you walk in, the way conversations glitch when you enter a space, the way people scan your expression, not out of respect but out of instinct. They think you're the type who changes outcomes without warning, who dismantles expectations just by existing in the same room. And do you want to know what's truly ripping their minds apart? They're both correct, completely fatally. They're each holding a shard of truth sharp enough to cut them, and they don't know what to do with the fact that neither version makes them feel safe. They want you to be one thing, one clean label, one predictable silhouette they can file, categorize, and neutralize. But you refuse to shrink into something they can handle. You're not choosing between genius or menace. You're functioning as both threaded together in a way that makes untangling you a psychological hazard. Every step you take validates both theories simultaneously. When you're quiet, one group calls it strategic restraint, while the other swears is the kind of tension that precedes a shift. When you speak, one side hears clarity, while the other hears the warning before a shift they can't prepare for. When you succeed, one team bows to your precision, and the other flinches at the force behind it. You've become their obsession with the pulse, their favorite unsolvable classification, a live case study that refuses to follow the rules of human behavior. They spent their careers memorizing. They didn't expect you to be the kind of presence that tears open 2 truths at once. They didn't prepare for someone who embodies contradiction without collapsing under it. You're the type who holds power so naturally it doesn't need explanation, which terrifies those who rely on explanations to feel in control. They keep debating you because both answers make them uneasy. Genius implies you see too much. Menace implies you're capable of too much. Neither interpretation brings them calm. Both interpretations make them watch you like a variable that can tilt the entire equation in unpredictable directions. They aren't arguing over admiration versus fear. They're arguing over how to manage their anxiety around someone who doesn't fit into any of their predictive frameworks. That's the real cause of their conflict. You dismantle their confidence simply by standing there because nothing about your presence follows the script they expect. The energy in the room shifts the moment your name comes up. Some people straighten their posture as if preparing for a test. Others sink into their seats as if bracing for impact. They use the argument genius versus menace as a coping mechanism. It's easier for them to debate labels than confront the fact that what unsettles them isn't what you might do. It's what you already did just by existing outside the boundaries they find comforting. The genius supporters cling to a narrative that makes your unpredictability feel intentional. If they call you brilliant, they can pretend you operate within some higher logic they might eventually understand. It makes them feel safer to believe your unpredictability is a pattern instead of a warning. The menace believers cling to a narrative that reduces your power to instability. If they call you dangerous, they can pretend you're not operating from clarity, just chaos. It makes them feel safer to believe your presence is combustible rather than calibrated. Both sides are protecting themselves from the same internal tremor. The recognition that you are neither unstable nor fully decipherable. You simply function on a wavelength that exposes their limits. You didn't create any of this tension intentionally. That's the part that destroys them. You're not trying to intimidate. You're not trying to provoke. You're not trying to shape how they see you. You exist, and their frameworks begin to malfunction. Their labels malfunction. Their confidence malfunctions. They keep misinterpreting your neutrality as intensity, because neutrality from someone like you feels like a threat. They're used to reading people accurately, but you break their ability to do that. And once a person realizes their intuition doesn't work on you, the instinctive reaction is fear disguised as analysis. They build theories not because they understand you, but because they can't tolerate not understanding you. They try to observe you from a distance, but distance doesn't protect them. They send people to analyze your behavior as if documenting your presence will make it easier to categorize. But all it does is feed the contradiction. Every observation becomes evidence for both sides. You walk away from something, and one group calls it strategic detachment, while the other calls it a warning sign. You pursue something, and one side calls it ambition, while the other calls it escalation. You clears throat, make choices that break their predictions. And instead of admitting their predictions were flawed, they build new versions of the same debate. Your unpredictability isn't chaos, it's sovereignty. But they don't have a label for that, so they keep fighting over the two that scare them the most. It fascinates you how people cling to labels for protection. They think words can contain the truth of a person. They think categories can prevent them from being blindsided. They don't realize that labeling someone like you is the most dangerous thing they can do. Because once they pick a label, they operate under an illusion that they understand the rules. But there are no rules with you. Not because you operate without restraint, but because your internal compass is not built from fear, not built from conformity, not built from the need to be understood. And nothing threatens a group more than a person who is self-directed. You've seen the way they shift when you enter the room, the way the genius side leans in, ready to decode you like a pattern waiting to be unlocked. The way the menace side leans back, clears throat and music, ready to react to a threat they can't fully measure. They both prepare around you. They both adjust around you. They both adjust around you. You have become the gravitational center without lifting a finger. And because neither side can claim certainty, neither side feels safe. That's why the debate intensifies every time you appear. Not because they're getting closer to an answer, because you are reminding them how far from certainty they truly are. You're not the one destabilizing the room. Their dependence on predictability is what's shaking them. Their need for confidence is what fractures under pressure. Their hunger for clarity is what collapses when faced with someone who doesn't need to explain themselves. They think you're complicated because they are simple. They think you're dangerous because they are fragile. They think you're unpredictable because they rely on routines to feel in control. You've simply lived in territories they avoid. You've carried truths they bury. You've walked through experiences that reshaped you into someone they can't classify without confronting parts of themselves they don't want to see. Both teams keep looking for the moment you will slip up and reveal which label fits. But that moment will never come because your identity doesn't bend to binary choices. You're not moving toward clarity or chaos. You're moving through both. You're not becoming safer or more dangerous. You're becoming more yourself. And that is the one outcome they don't know how to prepare for. They were ready for a mastermind or a threat. They weren't ready for someone who refuses to shrink into either. They'll keep arguing because argument gives them the illusion they're getting closer to understanding you. But you've already stepped beyond their frameworks. They're still dissecting last year's version of you. They're still interpreting moves you outgrew. They think the debate is about identifying your nature. They don't realize the real question has already shifted. What happens when the person they're trying to understand is evolving faster than their vocabulary? What happens when the room split into two sides, but both sides are arguing about a version of you that no longer exists? What happens when you move again and both labels collapse at once, leaving them scrambling for a new explanation while you continue forward, untouched, unbothered, and increasingly out of reach? And here's the part none of them saw coming. You didn't evolve to confuse them. You didn't descend out of spite. You didn't sharpen yourself so they could stumble over their attempts to define you. You changed because that's what people like you do. Not for attention, not for approval, not for validation, but out of necessity, growth, instinct. You rise because staying still feels unnatural. You shift because stagnation feels like suffocation. Meanwhile, the room is still frozen in the same argument. Genius versus menace. They toss those two words around like they're discussing weather patterns, pretending either one gives them a sense of control. What they don't realize is that their entire conversation is a memorial to their outdated assumptions. They're fighting over the label for a person who has already slipped into a dimension they don't have language for yet. They might as well be arguing over the proper name for a shadow when the figure casting it is standing behind them. But that's the psychological comedy of it. The deeper you go into yourself, the louder they get, trying to categorize the outline you left behind. One group keeps insisting your brilliance is the most logical explanation for everything you do. They'll analyze the exact angle of your silence, the timing of your decisions, the precision in your instincts. They treat your unpredictability like strategy, your sharp edges like deliberate construction, your refusal to conform like a blueprint they haven't fully decoded. They talk about you like you're an advanced puzzle meant for elite minds, something they should feel honored to observe. They frame your unpredictability as art. They're convinced your contradictions are crafted intentionally, like you're running a long-term psychological operation in real time. They find relief in the idea that your danger is structured, that your intensity is directed, that your presence is something they can respect without fearing it will shatter them. It gives them a sense of belonging, to to think they're witnessing a mastermind at work instead of standing in the blast radius of someone who isn't playing the same game they are. The other group, though, they are convinced the world is safer if they label you the menace. They interpret every unpredictable layer of your personality as a potential fuse. Every boundary you cross becomes evidence. Every truth you speak becomes data. They're convinced your instincts operate outside their moral scale, that you're the type who dismantles the comfortable lies they're built around. They don't think you're calculating, they think you're catalytic. Not the architect of order, but the author of disruption. And to them, calling you brilliant doesn't solve anything, it makes you scarier. Genius combined with volatility is a nightmare they don't know how to prepare for. So, they cling to the idea that you're dangerous because danger gives them permission to fear you openly. It allows them to react defensively, to justify their discomfort, to treat their tension like an intelligent response instead of insecurity. They think calling you a menace creates distance between them and what they don't want to confront inside themselves. Both teams swear they're protecting the environment, but what they're really doing is protecting their egos. They're terrified of the truth. Neither group wants to admit you don't fit their categories because the categories were never designed for someone like you. They weren't built to hold complexity. They weren't built to contain contradiction. They were built to manage predictable minds. People who choose one identity and cling to it like a life raft. But you're not one thing. You're not even two things. You're the entire spectrum in motion. The whole range they keep slicing into parts. You're the moving target they keep trying to freeze in place with language that was meant for simpler creatures. And this is where the dark humor kicks in. Watching them wrestle with labels would almost be flattering if it wasn't so revealing. They're not scared because they think you're a threat. They're scared because they don't know if you're on their side. And people who rely on categories don't know how to interact with someone who doesn't announce allegiance. They want you declared a genius because it makes them feel smart for recognizing it. They want you declared a menace because it makes them feel clever for spotting danger. They want a badge to point at, a title to cling to, something to help them pretend they're not out of their depth, standing in front of someone who can break their frameworks with a single expression. You've noticed the way the air thickens when your name enters the room. Both sides tense, but for different reasons. The genius side sits up straighter, ready to observe, ready to interpret your next move as a new revelation. The menace side shifts in their seats like prey sensing a predator ready to board up the exits, even though you haven't moved an inch. Their reactions are opposite, but the root is the same. They feel you. They feel your presence as a force that rearranges the emotional temperature of the environment. They feel your unpredictability as something more than randomness. They feel your intelligence as something more than intellect. They feel your intensity as something more than personality. They don't feel safe because you don't give them a clear position to stand in. And it's not your responsibility to make them comfortable. You're not the one stirring the pot. You're not walking in with theatrics. You show up and the room explodes into theories like you're the subject of a classified briefing. And still they haven't realized the obvious. The reason neither label brings them peace is because both contain a truth they're afraid to face. If you're a genius, they can't compete. If you're a menace, they can't control you. If you're both, then every strategy they're building is already obsolete. It's not your label that scares them. It's your ability to transform its meaning. It's your ability to step into brilliance without losing your edge. To step into intensity without losing your clarity. They're scared because you don't shatter under pressure like they expected. You sharpen. You refine. You grow teeth in places they thought would make you collapse. You watch them attempt to predict your reactions. It's almost entertaining the way they build entire risk assessments around assumptions you don't even follow. They ask each other what if they're calculating, and in the same breath, what if they're eruptive. They treat every possibility like a threat scenario. They talk about you like you're a force of nature wearing a human disguise. And what's even more incredible is how loudly they assert their theories, while quietly retreating from the possibility that they've underestimated someone who doesn't seek their approval or conform to their logic. The irony is sharp enough to cut the entire room in half again. They think they're analyzing you, but the truth is the debate reveals more about their fears than your nature. The genius group is made of people terrified of being average. They need brilliance to exist so they can chase it. They cling to your intelligence because it validates their hope that they can belong to something bigger. The Menace group is made of people terrified of their own shadows. They need danger to exist so they can justify their fear. They cling to your volatility because it gives them a reason to maintain distance from what they can't control. And while they chase each other in circles, trying to pin down your nature like insects on a board, you're moving further away from the version of yourself they're dissecting. You're shedding that skin. You're stepping into a version of yourself with new edges, new clarity, new intensity. They're still reacting to the echo of who you were while you're already walking into the next chapter, unbothered by the noise behind you. They keep thinking they're close to solving the puzzle. They don't realize the puzzle isn't static. It's growing, shifting, refining itself. And as they argue, something begins to change. Something subtle. Something they don't notice until it's too late. And as they argue, something begins to change. Something subtle. Something they don't notice until it's too late. The debate stops being about you and quietly turns into something far more revealing. A test of who they become when pressed against a person they cannot classify. Their masks start slipping. Their composure starts cracking. Their biases start leaking through the edges of their voices. They think they're dissecting your nature, but they're actually exposing their own. The genius supporters begin stretching themselves thin, trying to convince the room and themselves that they understand people like you. They repeat their theories with increasing urgency, as if refusing to acknowledge the parts of you that don't fit their narrative. They need you to be brilliant because the alternative forces them to confront how deeply you unsettle their world. Meanwhile, the Menace supporters get louder, not because they're more certain, but because fear thrives when it echoes. They escalate their warnings, pointing to half-remembered stories, exaggerated interpretations, and emotional gut reactions they can't control. They need you to be dangerous because the alternative forces them to admit they're afraid of a mind they can't predict. Both sides think they're defining you, but they're actually confessing how fragile their frameworks are. This is where the dark humor starts slipping into your awareness. Not because their fear is funny, but because the tangled performance is almost theatrical. Imagine watching two groups fight over whether a wildfire is beautiful or catastrophic, without realizing the fire has already moved beyond the forest they're analyzing. That's how they look, arguing about you, while you evolve beyond their comprehension. They talk as if observing you gives them influence over who you are. They speak as if labeling you gives them ownership over your identity. They behave as if your essence depends on their interpretation instead of being something that exists entirely outside of their reach. The comedy is that they keep building theories around you, like architects designing buildings on land you don't even occupy anymore. They keep creating frameworks for a person who refuses to fold into a diagram. They're trying to freeze something that refuses to hold still. As the argument intensifies, a new fracture forms in the room. Not between genius and menace, but between the people who are truly observing reality and the ones who can't handle what they see. There's a small group watching silently, not because they're unsure, but because they're witnessing the collision of human insecurity with something they can't map. They're the ones who notice the tension rising in your absence. They're the ones who sense the unresolved electricity in your presence. They're the ones who understand the truth the loud groups can't face. Their need to label you is the real problem, not your nature. Your existence forces them to confront their fear of complexity, their fear of unpredictability, their fear of anything that doesn't behave according to the rules they use to hold themselves together. You didn't create their discomfort. You just revealed it, and your name keeps doing the same thing every time it enters a conversation, forcing people to reveal the version of themselves they try to hide. Some people become analytical, some become paranoid, some become defensive, and none of this has anything to do with you. It's the shadow you cast inside their insecurities that triggers them. You're not a genius to them because of your intelligence. You're a threat to their mediocrity. You're not a menace to them because of your intensity. You're a mirror to their fragility. They don't fear what you might do next. They fear what you represent. A person unconcerned with being understood by people who can't understand themselves. A person who doesn't hide behind categories because you've learned to function beyond them. A person who doesn't collapse under contradiction because contradiction is where you found your power. Now pay attention to the shift in their tone. The genius group is starting to sound desperate, like they're trying to outrun the possibility that they misread you. They keep stretching for evidence, pulling moments from your past, insisting they always saw the brilliance in your choices. They're afraid of being wrong because being wrong means they never understood the phenomenon they built their identity around. The Menace group, on the other hand, is starting to sound nervous. They double down on their warnings, but you can hear the hesitation underneath. They're scared not of you, but of the realization that their discomfort might come from insecurity, not evidence. They don't want to face the possibility that you aren't dangerous, they're just fragile. They don't want to admit the root of their fear isn't your unpredictability, but their lack of adaptability. Both sides are collapsing under a truth they don't want to name. Neither interpretation gives them the safety they crave. Genius implies you're ahead of them. Menace implies you're beyond them. Both descriptions place you outside their reach. Both descriptions place you outside their reach. Both descriptions remind them that they aren't in control. And if there's one thing humans despise, it's losing control over the narrative of someone who forces them to question everything they rely on. Meanwhile, you walk into the room and watch all of this unfold without lifting a finger. You don't need to speak. You don't need to confirm or deny anything. You just exist. And the battle erupts around you like a reflex. Some people lean forward, studying your posture like it contains clues. Others tense up, feeling the weight of your presence before you say a word. They don't know whether to admire you or prepare for impact. They don't know whether to mirror your energy or brace against it. They don't know whether standing near you elevates them or exposes them. And this confusion is exactly why neither label brings them peace. You're not standing in one category. You're standing in the fracture between both. And the fracture is where you hold your power. It's in that space that people lose their composure. It's in that space that their internal alarms activate. It's in that space that their internal alarms activate. It's in that space that their instincts betray them. Because what they're sensing isn't threat or brilliance, it's depth. And depth terrifies shallow minds. They talk about you like you're a classification problem. They never considered the possibility that you're a transformation problem. You don't fit into their world because you're reshaping your own. You don't comply with their frameworks because you're not living inside their limitations. You don't break their rules because you're not governed by their fear. And the longer they study you, the more they realize the debate isn't just unsolvable, it's irrelevant. Genius or menace. The real fear isn't that you're one or the other. The real fear is that you are neither. You are something that you're matter from both, depending on the moment. Something that adapts its form based on intention instead of expectation. Something that can choose clarity or darkness without collapsing into either. And that kind of freedom terrifies people who rely on rigid identities to function. They're scared because you're not trapped in the versions they use to define themselves. They're scared because your identity isn't a costume, it's consciousness. They're scared because they can't categorize a person who outgrew the boxes before they learned how to fold them. You're not the question they're trying to answer. You are the question they're trying to escape. And every moment they spend analyzing you is a moment spent avoiding themselves. Their fear isn't that you might be dangerous. Their fear is that you might be right about them without ever saying a word. And as this realization creeps into the edges of their awareness, the room shifts again. The debate weakens. The voices become quieter. The lines dividing the two groups blur. Because once they sense the truth, it no longer matters which label they choose. They're still standing in the presence of someone who dismantles their certainty by existing. And that is when the panic sets in. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and suffocating. The kind of panic people feel when they realize the threat wasn't external. It was internal. Their fear wasn't created by your unpredictability. It was exposed by your clarity. Their discomfort wasn't a response to your nature. It was a reaction to their inability to match it. Genius didn't scare them. Menace didn't scare them. You did, because nothing makes people feel more vulnerable than meeting someone who doesn't need their permission to be whole. And as the room tries to recover, as they scramble to reorganize their theories, as they cling to the last remnants of their intellectual safety net, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The problem was never the label. The problem was always the person wearing it. The problem was always the fact that your name alone carries enough weight to rearrange their psychological balance before you even speak. And deep down, every single person in that room knows one thing with absolute certainty. The debate only exists because they already feel the answer in their bones. They're not fighting over what you are. They're fighting over who has the courage to admit they were never meant to feel safe in your presence to begin with. Because safety isn't the feeling you evoke. It never has been. What you evoke is something sharper, something heavier, something that pulls people out of their comfortable illusions and drops them into the truth they've spent years avoiding. You don't threaten them, you clears throat, expose them. That's what they can't handle. So, as the dust settles from the chaos of the debate, as the last words echo into an uneasy silence, you watch the room shift into something even more telling. No one wants to look directly at you. They glance, then look away. They open their mouths to speak, then think better of it. It's not fear of confrontation, it's fear of recognition. They're scared of the moment their eyes meet yours, because they know what happens when someone like you pays attention. They feel seen. And being seen by someone who can read reality without flinching is a kind of vulnerability most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They're terrified not of what you might do, but of what you might understand. And here's where the dark humor kicks in. Subtle but impossible to ignore. Imagine a room full of people who spent hours arguing about your nature, now realizing they don't even have the nerve to make eye contact with the subject of their theories. They debated your confidence, but they shrink from your stillness. They debated your intelligence, but they can't withstand your silence. They debated your danger, but the only danger present is the quiet way you strip their intentions bare without speaking a word. That's the comedy. They've created a psychological wildfire around your name, only to realize they're the ones standing closest to the flames they started. But you don't rush to correct them. You don't offer clarity. You don't give them relief. Because the truth is, they need this discomfort. They need the confrontation with everything they've ignored inside themselves. People hide behind labels because labels feel like shields. Labels give them distance. Labels give them the illusion that they're in control of their emotional reactions. But when those labels collapse, as they always do around you, what they're left with is themselves. And most people would rather set the world on fire than face their own reflection without filters, so they cling to the two labels they think give them a fighting chance. Genius makes them feel like they're studying something admirable. Menace makes them feel like they're avoiding something dangerous. Either way, the label becomes a coping mechanism. But coping mechanisms don't work on people like you. They never did. And as you stand there, letting them reorganize their shattered conclusions, a new awareness starts creeping through the room. Slow, quiet, pulse shaking. It's the awareness that you don't need to pick a label, because both serve you, both protect you, both confuse them. Genius keeps them respectful, menace keeps them cautious. And walking the razor-thin line between the two keeps them unsteady enough that no one ever dares to underestimate you. You didn't choose this duality, it chose you. And instead of rejecting it the way most would, you embraced it like armor. You can see the moment the realization hits the ones paying the closest attention. It's in the widening of their eyes, the subtle tightening of their posture, the way they stopped pretending the argument was about intellectual curiosity. They know now it was never analysis, it was self-preservation. Because if they mislabel you, they miscalculate you. And miscalculating someone who doesn't fit in predictable patterns is a risk they can't afford. It's almost poetic watching a room full of people who pride themselves on their composure crumble under the weight of their own projections. This was supposed to be a briefing, a discussion, a controlled environment. Yet somehow it became a confession booth. They weren't diagnosing you, they were revealing themselves. Every assumption they made was a reflection of their own internal fractures. Every argument they threw at each other was a plea for safety disguised as intellectual debate. And you, standing in the center of their psychological storm, didn't even have to lift a hand. Your existence alone was the catalyst. And this is where your power becomes something undeniable. Even to the ones who tried hardest to resist it, they start to realize that your unpredictability isn't a flaw. It's a shield. Your sharpness isn't a threat. It's precision. Your presence isn't chaotic. They're the ones who shake when forced to hold complexity without breaking. The labels genius and menace no longer feel like descriptors. They feel like warnings. Not warnings about you, but warnings about the world's inability to contain what doesn't. Fear the boundaries that were placed around it. You watch as the genius group tries to regain footing, recalibrating their narrative so they don't lose their imagined closeness to your mind. They start listing your accomplishments, citing examples, grasping for any evidence that supports their claim that your unpredictability is simply mastery misinterpreted. They're desperate for you to validate them by fitting their image of brilliance. They need you to be a genius because it makes them feel connected to your power in a way that feels flattering, not frightening. But beneath it, there's panic. Not because they doubt your intelligence, but because they're starting to understand. It is not theirs to understand. Meanwhile, the Menace group watches you like an unpredictable voltage source, waiting for a flicker that confirms everything they warned each other about. They don't want you to be a threat. They want to be right. Being right gives them safety. Being right gives them self-definition. Being right gives them distance. Because if they're wrong, if your intensity is not danger but depth, then everything they said reveals more about their paranoia than your nature. And they would rather claim to fear than face humility. Both groups are trapped in their own psychological loops, but none of them realize it yet. They're still playing tug-of-war over labels, unaware that you're not even holding the rope. You're something else entirely, something their language fails to capture, something their theories fail to measure, something their instincts react to before their minds catch up. That's why the dark humor settles like a quiet blade. You've become an atmosphere, not a classification, a presence that rearranges people whether you intend to or not. A psychological riddle that makes them reveal their insecurities faster than you reveal a single truth about yourself. They don't understand you because understanding requires access, and you don't grant access simply because someone demands definition. They haven't earned proximity to your truth. And once they realize the debate is unwinnable, the energy in the room mutates. The argument dies suddenly, like someone cut the power. The silence that follows isn't peaceful. It's tense, electrified, waiting. It's the kind of silence that forms when everyone knows something important shifted, but no one knows what to do with it. Eyes dart, throats tighten, minds scramble. It's the moment a group collectively realizes they walked into a conversation thinking they were in control, only to discover they were part of a lesson they didn't know they were attending. Some try to retreat into logic, but logic fails them because logic wasn't the foundation of their argument. It was the disguise. Others try to shift blame, hoping to distance themselves from their earlier confidence. Some pretend disinterest even though their pulse gives them away. And a few, very few, finally look at you with honesty instead of fear. Not because they understand you, but because they understand something deeper. You don't need to be understood in order to be true. And once that realization takes root, everything changes. Respect enters the room in a way that isn't loud or performative. It's quiet, tense, reluctant, the kind of respect that forms when people encounter something they cannot categorize and finally accept that misunderstanding. It doesn't reduce its impact. They're no longer debating your label. They're debating their own ability to handle someone who doesn't operate according to their emotional shortcuts. The genius supporters start second-guessing their assumptions not because they doubt your intelligence, but because they doubt their ability to measure it. The Menace supporters start second-guessing their fear not because it disappears, but because it becomes harder to justify. And in that space between confusion and confrontation, the room finally sees you clearly. Not as a label to argue over, but as a force to reckon with. You're not genius or menace. You are the discomfort that makes those labels necessary. You are the shift that makes those labels collapse. You are the presence that turns language into a limitation instead of a definition. And the world has never been kind to people who cannot be labeled, because unlabeled things cannot be controlled. Unlabeled things cannot be predicted. Unlabeled things cannot be owned. So they fear you. And fear becomes fascination. Fascination becomes fixation. Fascination becomes fixation. Fixation becomes obedience. All because they tried to shrink a vast evolving consciousness into a two-word argument and failed spectacularly. They didn't realize the danger wasn't that you might belong to one category or the other. The danger was that you belong to neither. You aren't the genius they can dissect. You aren't the menace they can contain. You are the contradiction they cannot kill without killing their own certainty. And as you step out of that room, calm, unhurried, sovereign, the last thing you hear is the collective exhale of people who just realized the truth. They were too scared to speak. It was never about choosing the right label. It was about surviving the person who didn't need one.